Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome. My name is Khadija, and I'm with Noor Cultural Center, and we're so glad that you're able to join us today for the first in this series, What Islam Looks Like in Public. And we are so very honored. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just having one. Sorry, there we go. Sorry about that. So we are so very honored and excited to be hosting for this first session on Islamic ethics and social justice. We are so honored to have with us the eminent scholar and Sheikh Professor Khaled Abou Fadl, who is rejoining us at Noor Cultural Center. As usual, before we begin, just a few notes of housekeeping. If the sound isn't coming through well for you, please do try increasing the volume on your computer as well as on the YouTube video itself. There is also a live and automatic closed captioning feature on YouTube, which you should be able to click on an icon to enable on the video itself. If you'd like to rewatch this program or share with others, the video will be permanently available on the Noor Cultural Center YouTube channel, which is where you are right now. And we'll also be sending it out afterwards. So inshallah, no one should miss out on this wonderful program. As for direct engagement in this program, please use the comments box under the live feed of the video for conversation, comments, and questions. For this, you'll need a YouTube account, although just to watch it, you should not need one. Professor Abou Fadl will be taking some of your questions during the Q&A, and they'll be drawn from that space in the comment section. So please do ask away. And as our usual reminder, the comment section is a space to ask genuine questions and exchange comments and resources about the topic. We welcome all comments and questions from Muslims and non-Muslims that are posed in the spirit of honest inquiry, good faith, and allyship. Finally, you can also use that comment section to post any outstanding tech issues or concerns, and inshallah, we'll hopefully be able to provide you support with that. So with that, I pass it along to Aziza to introduce Sheikh Khaled Abou Fadl and the program for this afternoon. Assalamu alaikum, and please enjoy.
Thank you, Khadija. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings of peace. And thank you for joining us for this first session in a planned series exploring the implications of central Islamic ethical, spiritual, intellectual principles for contemporary struggles of social justice that we are all encountering. As Khadija said, my name is Aziza. I'm the Director of Programming here at Noor Cultural Center, and I'm speaking to you from Toronto, the land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas peoples. These land acknowledgements, far from being something as they are often used as a way of simply acknowledging Indigenous presence and then moving on to the real substance of the discussion, rather than these kinds of tokenistic land acknowledgements, these land acknowledgements are really at the heart of them a reminder, a constant reminder that any struggle for justice for us as Muslims has to begin first and foremost with the question of liberation and decolonization for the Indigenous peoples whose lands are currently continue to be occupied by the Canadian state, underwritten by tremendous amounts of colonial state violence. As the effects of the matrix of violence institutionalized domestically and globally continues to unfold, unleashing devastation for human and other than human beings alike, it is imperative that we examine the ideological, ethical, legal foundations that have given rise to these structures of mass devastation. it is becoming increasingly clear that the quote unquote solutions generated from within the ideological order that has produced the problem not only fail to resolve the problems, but instead act as a way of further entrenching and perpetuating the violence that lies at its very heart. Whether it be transnational extractive oil corporations now buying up land in the name of carbon offsetting in ways that end up further dispossessing indigenous nations that live on that land, or whether it be arms corporations who have profited tremendously from sowing conflict in the global south, now profiting doubly from building the walls, the border walls, to keep out the people fleeing the violence and conflict that their arms sales have sown. So it is imperative that instead of returning back to this same ideological structure for the solutions to the problems we face, that we re-excavate and re-examine our traditions, dismembered, fragmented by colonialism, for the intellectual, ethical, and moral resources that they hold for confronting these catastrophes that are threatening us as humans and other than humans both. So we are so delighted and honored to have with us back here today one of the most prominent and profound thinkers, not only on the contemporary conditions of violence that we face, but also on the resources held within Islamic traditions for thinking about how we might confront these problems and transform the world that has produced them. I'm sure Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl is someone who needs no introduction to many of you who are watching here today. He has been a central figure in shaping the way that many of us think about what it means to be a Muslim in today's world. And so I'll give him just a very brief introduction, and then we will move to some moderated discussion with Professor Abou Fadl, and then we will integrate your questions from the floor as they come in. So please, as this discussion unfolds, please do continue to put in any thoughts or comments or questions that you have that you would like to be included in the discussion. Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl is one of the world's leading authorities on Sharia, Islamic law, and Islam, and a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. He is the Omar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, political asylum and refugee law, the trafficking of human beings, law and policy, political crimes and legal systems, and Muslims, race and law. Among his many honors and distinctions, Dr. Abou Fadl was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award, the Leo and Lyle Attinger Prize in 2007, and named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law in 2005. A prolific scholar and prominent public intellectual, Dr. Abou Fadl is the author of numerous books and articles on various topics in Islam and Islamic law, his latest being Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in the Modern Age, which is such a beautiful book, and encourage all of you to read it. Dr. Abou Fadl is most noted for his scholarly approach to Islam from a moral point of view. He writes extensively on universal themes of humanity, morality, human rights, justice, and mercy, and is well known for his writings on beauty as a core moral value of Islam. I know for me personally, Dr. Abou Fadl's writings were fundamental in my decision to pursue a career in law and to pursue that beauty that Dr. Abou Fadl writes so beautifully about existing as being in our Islamic legal and intellectual traditions. And so I'm sure many of us here owe him a great debt of gratitude, and we are just so happy to have him here with us again today. So thank you, Dr. Abou Fadl.
Thank you. Very kind. Thank you.
So we're going to start with some questions from me, and then as questions come in from the audience, we'll incorporate them into the discussion. And perhaps we could start with the concept of public and private. The title of this series is What Islam Looks Like in Public inspired by a quote from the great Black philosopher and theologian Cornel West, who said that justice is what love looks like in public, love being commonly a concept that is restricted to being something that's relevant in the private realm, not relevant to public. And so Professor West's quote fundamentally impels us to rethink the public implications of concepts that are normally relegated to the private realm. Similarly, we know in the contemporary terrain where religion in Western democracies is relegated to something that is sequestered to the private realm, we want to explore what thinking about Islam and its spiritual principles that are normally considered to be primarily or properly of private relevance, what are the implications for the way we think about how we organize our lives together in public? And so perhaps could you start by talking about how, drawing on Islamic social and legal histories, we might think differently about the public-private divide, the divide between religion and politics, which, as we know from scholars like Talal Asad, is itself a product of long colonial genealogies, and therefore should also be problematized instead of being taken for granted as the neutral terrain upon which we have these discussions.
Yes, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Muhammad. Aziza, I mean, this is it's a tough question, because you are right. The sort of the attempt to create even a remotely coherent dichotomy between what is public and what is private. These categories themselves were driven by economic forces and power dynamics that are very much a product of modernity, and which we know, at its very heart, has colonialism as an essential agent, animating modernity and propelling modernity's movement, and a lot of times, hiding itself and shielding itself in the garb of modernity. Colonialism is sort of at the essence of it. But I think that what Cornel West's latest thought reflected in this quote, it actually touches upon something that is very important for the Islamic tradition. Often when we empty the public space of discourses about core human values, values like love, beauty, mercy, compassion, what remains is only what we can evaluate empirically. And so when we basically concede, we start out by conceding, well, we really can't come to a coherent definition of justice. We can't really come to a coherent definition of equity. We really can't come to a coherent definition of mercy, compassion. We can't really come to a coherent definition of beauty. We sort of concede that these lofty principles are all to be sacrificed, because that we can see that that relativism sort of eats them up, that because we can't define them, so we just abandon them. That all that is left ends up being the stark empirical assessment, which literally basically ends up a world in which the only relevant value system is cost and benefit. I mean, the profit and loss. And one of the core roles of religion, and one of the essential functions of religion, is to get human beings to believe in not just a higher power, but to get human beings to believe in higher values. To the fact that you are aspiring and dreaming, the fact that you cannot the fact that you cannot fulfill what you dream of perfectly doesn't make dreaming irrelevant, and doesn't make lofty concepts, normative concepts, doesn't mean that they become suddenly irrelevant. And so, I mean, this phrase, this quote is fascinating, because, you know, what love looks like in public. Because if you are going to go for formal justice, strict justice, all we have to evaluate that justice are these empirical measures of, you know, who gets this amount, who loses this amount. But what real justice requires is something more. It requires empathy. It requires care. It requires a sense of communal bonding, a sense of even willingness to even the principle of justice, do unto others as you would like done unto you. That requires a level of higher thinking beyond empiricism, because you can't achieve that value. You can't even come close to achieving that value if all you have are empirical measures. And so what love looks like in the public sphere is that in order to have real justice, you must care. And you not just care, but you must believe in human beings. You must believe that every human being is worth it, that human beings cannot be commodified, should not be commodified. A human being is not just a dollar amount. So if I come to the issue, for instance, without higher values, if a native population lives on land, and under this land are minerals, oil, strict economic logic would come and say, well, you know, we need this oil, put a dollar amount on what it takes to get this native population to get out of the way, basically, and go pursue the oil. It's a simple logic, but that is formal justice, is superficial justice that ultimately ends up being injustice. When the cumulative effect of that is that it is always that power gets its way, because power has the ability to assign the dollar sum. And what is needed is these higher values that come in and say, well, there are things that you can't put a dollar amount on. And there are considerations beyond economic value. Islam as a moral force, I mean, what is it that, what is the essential and core lesson repeatedly in the Quran? Is that to truly engage in ibadah, you must use what God gave you, all of us as human beings, use what God gave us by giving each its due right. So if I use water, I am fully aware this water is not mine, it's God's. And when I use this water, I must use it in a way that honors the divine. If I use a tree, if I carve a road, if I build a house, I am constantly aware that I am a guest in this universe that has an owner, a higher power, and that I give each its due. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Addul amanat, fulfill your trusts. We were just talking about this in a class, in a halaqah very recently. Life, as Allah has created it from an Islamic perspective, is the amana that is owed to you and the amana that you owe others. All of us, there is, even when I'm, for instance, when I make money, I am holding this money as an amana for the rights that my children possess, for the rights that my spouse possesses, for the rights that my community possesses, for the rights that the indigent possesses, the rights that a refugee possesses. And ultimately, what Allah will hold me to account for is how I discharged my amana towards this money. If I abuse the trust by spending this money in immoral ways and not giving those who are due, those who have rights upon me, their due, I violated the trust. So Islam in the public is not about a set of positive laws of do's and don'ts. It is about believing in human beings, believing that life has meaning, that existence has meaning, that human beings should aspire for higher values, that human beings are not simply about empiricized values that we assign to them, or that their actions and their willpower, the will of a human being, does not necessarily boil down to a dollar amount. This is, and that's why choosing that quote from Cornel West is it's like the same thing in the book that I wrote, The Search for Beauty. What Islamic life is about is a constant search for the fulfillment of the trust. God is beautiful and loves beauty. So understanding that beauty, pursuing that beauty, sprouting that beauty wherever we are, being an embodiment of beauty, being a Rabbani, being a godly human being, as opposed to the ungodly human being. And that it can only manifest through beauty, and beauty must be comprehensible to other human beings. I can't, act in a way and call it beautiful if everyone else in the world looks at it and doesn't understand what the heck I'm doing. It's not just, that's dictatorial, that's capricious, that's a form of arrogance. I'll say, well, I'm saying that that's beautiful, and although the rest of the world might look at it and say, wow, that's really ugly, I say, well, I don't care. That's not how it works. The God is beautiful. It's, I'll stop on this. Part of the Islamic tradition that we don't teach our children, there's hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that Allah blesses a human being, blesses those who teach human beings to love God. And Allah curses human beings who repel fellow human beings away from God. You as a Muslim must become a demonstrative example of the beauty of godliness, what it means to be godly. Because if people engage you or encounter you and they're not attracted to the godly because you're not attractive, then we have a problem. Then you're not an agent of dawah. You are agent of something else, and that's a big problem.
I think it seems that beauty too, like love, is something that's been reduced to almost a superficial concept, a question of just appearances or physicality. Whereas in your telling, beauty, nothing could actually be more deeper and more profound and more transformative than beauty. So thank you so much for that. You've spoken so powerfully about how the evacuation of love and morality from the public sphere cedes it completely to the ground of empirical capitalist measures. But it seems that even what's taken as empirical objective measures themselves are frequently simply the projections of power and the projections of the powerful. In Canada, right now, we have a so-called freedom convoy of primarily white protesters that have been terrorizing communities in Ottawa and across the country, invoking an idea of freedom that is really, in essence, white freedom, the concept of freedom that was developed by colonizers, explicitly citing figures like Thomas Jefferson, a father of freedom, who was a slave holder. And so even when we do have the introduction of these higher values into the public sphere, they are so often the way that these values have been formulated in order to justify the depredations of the powerful as perversely as being moral exercises, as exercises of freedom or of morality or justice or of civilization. But we know from our Islamic perspective that these pretensions and claims that humans make to supremacy over one another and over the natural world are fundamentally challenged by the central recognition of Allahu Akbar, that God is greater than anything that we can imagine, and by the prohibition of shirk, the prohibition of worshiping anything other than Allah, which feminist scholars like Amina Wadud have deployed so powerfully to argue that the absolute unicity and supremacy of God is the vertical fulcrum that holds all of our relationships on earth to each other in a horizontal balance. It has been deployed by decolonial thinkers like Houreya Bouteja to say that as Muslims then who recognize Allahu Akbar, that we cannot accept anything like sunflowers who only bow to the sun and refuse to subjugate ourselves to any other form or hierarchy of oppression. And we know the introduction of Islam was a profoundly transformative moral and social force when it came and was institutionalized, such that it transformed the very moral vocabulary and introduced a whole new universe of moral concepts and way of thinking about what it means to have ethical relationships with each other and with the world. And so can you talk a bit about what some of the social implications are that flow from the recognition of that God is greater, that Allah is greater, and the prohibition on worshiping anything other than Allah? How would that compel us to rethink some of the ways that violence and power are organized contemporarily?
Well, I mean, Aziza, you put it so eloquently. Allah bless you. Barakallahu fiki. You see, I think it's really critical that that as Muslims collectively, because we have a lot of work to do if we are going to be able to rise to the challenge that the faith that Allah has entrusted to us, if we are going to do right by it. Islam, we often, and partly because the writing of our history has been itself colonized, and the birth of historicism was it's a modern discipline. Historicism is a modern discipline, and it was born in the shadow of colonialism. And so, and as a result, we are often disconnected from understanding our history and the telling of our history. The history that the Quran documents, the Quran itself, you even don't need more than the Quran. The Quran itself documents the relevant history of Islam. And we often forget that what Islam, the Quranic Islam, the Islam of the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, the Islam of Allahu Akbar, was a revolution. And it was a revolution that inspired al-mustad'afin, the disempowered and the dispossessed. There are tons and tons of stories about, how the Qurayshis would come to the Prophet Muhammad and say, we are willing to talk to you, to negotiate with you, but remove the riffraff from the way. The Quran makes several interventions affirming and emphasizing the principle that no, just because someone is a higher class or nobility, they are not going to get preference over a poor blind man or a poor woman that comes to the Prophet, and so on. The Quran is a consistent, systematic narrative about the moral values and the obligation that human beings owe towards the disempowered, the orphans, the wayfarer, who's basically modern day refugee, the orphans, modern day refugees, the indigents, the people in need, and the tafsir of the Quran that I'm currently doing, it emphasizes surah after surah after surah after surah that constantly affirms Islam as a moral revolution. Amin al-Wadud calls it the Tawhidic paradigm. But in essence is that, as succinctly put by the companions of the Prophet ﷺ in several occasions, that the Islam came to end human beings worshiping one another, to take human beings from the worshiping of fellow human beings to the worshiping of God. A very simple, clear, succinct way of putting it. The Prophet ﷺ emphasizes, even in his last sermon, there is no racial difference between you. There's no ethnic differences between you. There are no class differences between you. You are not allowed to brag or hold favor over one another by your lineage and by your, tribal affiliation. So, and it was a revolution. But there is also a reality that we have to come to terms with, and that is the moral program of the Quran was very advanced for its historical moment. And shortly after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr did the best he can, Umar ibn Khattab did the best he can, Osman did the best he can, but he ends up being assassinated, of course, like Umar, but under very different circumstances. And then we have Imam Ali, but very quickly, what rose is an empire, and the empire interpreted Islam in a way that was often really intention and very so quite often a clear contradiction, but at minimum, intention, and the persecution of Ahlul Bayt in Islamic history, it demonstrates this. The Ahlul Bayt were always, they standing for the ideal, for the Quranic ideal, and the state, the empire, and the was all that empires mean, and so the Quranic potential is endless and limitless, and it's not bound by time. And when we say Allahu Akbar, it could become a true message of liberation if we give it its due right. But we have to be very honest about the production of imperial Islam and the way that it undercut the Islamic project. So when kids learn the fabricated hadith that arose out of the empire, that you must obey a ruler even if that ruler beats you and takes your money, and basically don't defy, accept inequities and injustices as God's will, and don't challenge them and don't defy them. That's imperial Islam, and it is fundamentally inconsistent with Quranic Islam, which constantly basically says you are on earth to work towards what is good, what is moral. Leave the results to God. Don't worry about the results. It's not your job to say there's no point, there's no use. You must only ask yourself what is right and do what is right. And here, I think it is really one last point. The reality of the matter is, you mentioned this caravan movement, or the like. We continue to live in the shadow of colonialism. Formal colonialism, maybe rude, stark colonialism in its formalistic sense has ended, but all the institutions of colonialism remain. And a central part of the institution of colonialism was the project of whiteness. The invention of an ill-defined superior race that, look around the world and you find we still live in a world in which the white race, wherever it is, whether it's in Australia or New Zealand or of course Europe or America or Canada, it dominates. That there is a certain tribal affinity between however you define whiteness, between all those who are defined as white, and that race it continues to deal with the world from a point of view of clear privilege and entitlement. Look at the way we react to the loss of life of any white person in any white country, as opposed to, no one knows till now how many people we killed in Afghanistan. No one knows how many people we killed in Iraq. No one knows, and no one cares how
But
many.
everyone knows exactly how many American soldiers.
Yeah, and it is a very big deal. I mean, if a white-looking person dies in Israel, the entire world pauses, or dies in France. But there's more dark-skinned people are lost here, lost in Yemen, lost in Somalia, lost all over Africa. No one cares. Whiteness, Muslims must understand that they can't avoid the fact that race has played a hegemonic role in the modern civilization, which is a Western civilization, and that whiteness as a race is an immoral category. I believe that to be white is immoral because it was a constructed race a race constructed to dominate and to control and to vanquish and to erase everything that is imagined not to be white. So all the anxiety all over Europe about, the cultural purity of Europe, which we see in France, we see in every European country, and it mirrors that. The anxiety about if Muslims are talking about the Khilafah, we've got to go to use any amount of violence to eradicate any talk about anything that scares us as white people. Well, what scares you as white people? Well, it's intimately interconnected with the history of whiteness in colonialism, and the way that colonialism constructed and implemented and furthered the whiteness project, or what used to be called the white man's burden. I mean, in times when people, were not embarrassed to say that, but that continues. And the world often, and Muslims are rather oblivious to this, the extent to which the world suffers because the white race, however constructed, becomes anxious about losing its privileges, losing its hegemonic position. And when they become anxious, they inflict suffering, whether that suffering is looking the other way when it comes to selling of, the smuggling of drugs into the United States and flooding the ghettos of New York with crack and drugs, or whether that anxiety is in monitoring Muslim Islamic centers, everywhere, and spying on Muslims and hiring an army of informants to keep Muslims in check, or that anxiety, or whether that takes the form of the United States having black sites all over the world and killing Muslims at will and without accountability. In all, now we've pre 9/11 and after 9/11, because it didn't start with 9/11. This existed before 9/11. The United States has been killing, assassinating, using violence against Muslims all over the world before 9/11, after 9/11, and in the course of that, in the course of 2 unlawful invasions and 2 unlawful occupations of 2 Muslim countries, add to that our unlawful involvement in Somalia, add to that the horrendous actions of the French government in many African states, including overthrowing governments and arming certain parties, making sure, engaging in military strikes. Even the French government, in collision with the Egyptian government, where they killed 40,000 people at the border between Egypt and Libya. 40,000 people. No one heard about it, and even when it was leaked and exposed, the world didn't pause, because those 40,000 people are all dark skinned. When an Italian kid was killed by the fascist government in Egypt, the whole world heard about it. But the untold numbers of dark-skinned non-whites who've been killed by the same government, no one cares. Part of Muslims maturing, part of Muslims growing up, I really mean that, growing up. It's like, it's time that they stop being children, is to realize what the project, or what the racial project has been and continues to be, and to realize that your religion is diametrically opposed to the racial project, and to realize that if you don't realize how your religion is thoroughly inconsistent with that racial project, we have a serious problem. And that you cannot have Islam even achieve some of its potential, some of its moral potential in the world, as long as the world continues to submit to this racial project that the world has existed under since colonialism. And that's a, unfortunately, still a lot of Muslims want to believe that they live in a post-racial world. And as it sometimes really confounds me. How do you really convince yourself of that?
So we had a question from the audience asking why, as Muslims, we should be concerned with whiteness instead of focusing on the problems within Muslim communities. But to add on to that and to extrapolate from that, I think that whiteness it's the globalized context within which we live, within which relationships of power and violence within Muslim communities are organized. But whiteness also structures the way that as Muslims we read our own histories and our own pasts. So for example, you talked about the promulgation of imperial Islam and imperial conceptualizations of Islam, which counsel us to simply be complacent in the face of injustice and to make ourselves amenable to systems of oppression. But we know that there are so many Muslim histories that run directly counter to that. We know that Islam, for example, was an inspiration for those who were enslaved in Latin America to wage revolts and revolutions against their slave masters. You've written so beautifully in your books about how Islamic law and Islamic legal scholars worked separately from state power and very often in opposition to state power, a legacy that is now completely betrayed by efforts to make Islamic law the purview of the state and an instrument for the further accumulation of state power. And so in addition to answering the question about whiteness, can you also talk about some of the histories that have been erased in colonial historiographies, but that are precisely the histories that we can draw upon now to think about Islam as a revolutionary tradition to counter these multiple layered structures of oppression that we're facing?
No, you know what? This is what's remarkable is that as oppressive as the imperial project was, the imperial project, as much as the state tried to control the construction and representation of Sharia, the state was never fully successful. They would make inroads, but it always went against the grain. And I believe it's because of the Quran as a central document that continued to inspire. So every resistance movement, even resistance movements to pre-colonialism, resistance movements to various forms of injustice that existed before we entered into, the European Renaissance and then eventually the birth of colonialism. It was inspired by Islamic liberation principles. And Islamic liberation principles was constantly a pain in the back of colonialism. Colonialism consistently would clash with Islamic liberation principles, and colonialism would try to ally itself with, natives who would be willing to affirm the colonial project in some form or another. And so what we have to, there are several things. What we really have to come to terms with is that, remember that epistemology, systems of knowledge, is very, very powerful. Systems of knowledge is how we know anything, how you understand anything. People don't realize that the extent to which what they think they know has been influenced and directly constructed by the other. Constantly, your sense of values, your sense of what is acceptable, not acceptable, what turns you off, what turns you on, it's constantly being engineered, purposely or not so purposely, by everything that surrounds you. Now, why is this important? Because the truth of the matter is that systems of knowledge in the historical moment we live in has been influenced by the development of certain disciplines like history, sociology, anthropology, political science, literary criticism, and all these disciplines were born without a direct Muslim contribution, because Muslims have been on the receiving end. It's constructed by others, and then sort of Muslims either choose to ignore them, and when they ignore them, they become entirely marginal and irrelevant to everything in the world because they don't even speak a language that the world understands, or they just transplant them and borrow them, which means that till now, remarkably, we don't own our own narrative about our own liberation stories, about our own history, about as you've pointed out, Islamic native, the history of Islamic native populations, the adat, the customs, the practices is so nuanced and rich, but so much of this nuance and richness is emptied out in the dominant Western narrative about Islam, which we basically adopted about. So for instance, if I just ask a Muslim, average Muslim, do you know a person like Abu Dharr al-Ghafari? And can you tell me what is the value of Abu Dharr al-Ghafari in Islamic history? The vast majority of Muslims have no clue. What is the significance of Al-Hijr bin Adi? No, the vast majority have no clue. They might know, they might have heard of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, whoever, Machiavelli and Irsa. But when it comes to Islam, and even someone like Ibn Taymiyyah has been co-opted politically, and so people really have no sense. And this is an impoverishment of the Islamic intellectual tradition and Islamic morality and Islamic normative existence. Why am I saying all of this? Because why can't we ignore whiteness? Well, and I know that a lot of Muslims will be surprised to hear this, but okay, your religion came and said no to racism and racial paradigms. Your religion came, and at the time when no one talked about racial equality, your religion came and actually mandated racial equality. But what do you do about a world, whether you like it or not, a world that the way that world has developed in the age we live in is a world in which racial inequality, a racist paradigm, has become not dominant but hegemonic. If you don't believe me, look around. Why is it that a country like Australia becomes a part of the developed world, although the history of the country is quite young? A country like New Zealand becomes a part of the developed world, although the history of the country is quite young. South Africa, to the extent it is white, it is developed. To the extent it's not white, it's problematic. A country like Israel, which was propelled into the developed world, the part of the story that all of us like to ignore is that because they are part of a club, They are the transfer of technology and the system of cooperation and exchange allows these countries to fast track into the developed world, while countries that are not white are not fast tracked. And in fact, a lot of times obstruct it, and a lot of times are resisted. So what we end up with, again, just look around the world you live in. There is a particular race that defines commodities, assigns value systems to these commodities, that influence the way our people, our children think and feel, that control the flow of information and even the value system that we all rely on to exchange products, the dollar, and has the power. I mean, look, with one decision, the United States is able to doom thousands and thousands of Afghanis to starvation by simply saying, we're not going to give you your money. It's done. We as Muslims must seek a more equitable world. And a more equitable world is not possible unless we join the project of explaining to the world that whiteness is an immoral category. That unfortunately, however you construct whiteness, it was an abusive category from the time that it claimed to have scientific pretensions to our very day. Whiteness initially tried to claim that there is some scientific basis for defining what is white. But even the U.S. Supreme Court, a lot of people don't know this, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a very famous decision, struggled with trying to find a scientific basis for defining whiteness, and then ultimately, in a very famous decision, abandoned that and said, we can't define whiteness scientifically, we're just going to define it socially. Whiteness is what other white people say it is. And although the United States eventually abolished a clear racial quotas, but the institutional racism remains very much part of what the US is, what Britain is, what France is, what Denmark is, what Canada is. I mean, and you can't ignore it. And if you ignore it at your own risk, because you will simply become delusional. There is a tribe that calls itself white, whatever that means, that dominates, and you are trying to say, well, no, you don't really exist because I don't want you to exist. Well, it doesn't work that way. You have to come to terms with the realities that we live in the modern world. A lot of the challenge for Muslims is to just simply wake up to sort of, it's like a child coming out of just maturing and come to terms with the realities of the world they live in.
Thank you so much for that. For people in the audience who are interested in reading more about the cases that Professor Abou Fadl mentioned on the way that American courts constructed whiteness and thought about it, there's an excellent book by Ian Haney Lopez called White by Law, The Legal Construction of Race in America, which examines these cases as well as the incoherence ultimately of the scientific conceptualization of racism, but how it recapitulates, yes.
That's the book.
And in which he also says that increasingly, instead of overtly racial categories, we have the reproduction of race through seemingly neutral categories. And I think we can think about terrorism as being one of those apparently facially racially neutral categories, which is really just a synonym. Terrorism effectively serves as a synonym for violence committed by Muslims. Another book people might be interested in.
Go ahead. No, I'm interested in hearing what other books you're going to mention.
Oh, for people who are interested in the types of relationships between white countries that Professor Abou al-Fadl was talking about in constructing the contemporary global order. There's a book called Drawing the Global Color Line about the relationships between white men's countries and how they, through transnational flows of legal inspiration, for example, formulated contemporary immigration, racially discriminatory immigration orders. And so far from being whiteness, far from being something that's simply ephemeral, it's actually been built into domestic and global institutions that continue to structure relationships of exclusion and domination today. So thank you so much for that, Professor Abou al-Fadl. We have a question from Gustav about anti-Black racism within Muslim societies. He says, as a Black person living in Cairo, he really noticed how he struggled more than French people. And so what is needed to deconstruct racism in majority Muslim countries? Are there people doing it already?
Not enough, not nearly enough. Because the reality is that a lot colonized societies, sadly, ended up being infected by a lot of the diseases of those who colonized them. So till today, till our very day, if you are in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the Gulf countries, there's a clear racial hierarchy. And you feel it right away. If you are a Saudi, the top class are people from the Gulf. So if you are a Saudi in Saudi Arabia, or if you are an Emirati in Saudi Arabia or Kuwaiti, but equal to that class or even higher are white people. And if you are, the darker skinned you are in these same countries, the lesser you are. So if you are an Arab or from India or from Bangladesh, and everyone knows that, everyone that knows, and sometimes even there are differentials in how much you're paid. If you're white, you're paid more for the same job, leave alone treated much better. And in countries like, and part of that, in our history, the remarkable thing is, I was once researching this for an article that I wanted to write, and maybe I should go back to it. There was often when in Islamic poetry and in Islamic literature from various periods in Islamic history, when beauty is described, there would always be the beauty would be female beauty described in terms of Samara. Samara is being darker skinned, and whiteness was often sort of described as paleness, being pale skinned, and it was considered unattractive. That changes very drastically after colonialism. And not only does the value system of that, and it took several decades. I mean, it wasn't instantaneous, but but today, people go as far as in many southern countries. People go as far as like putting on creams to try to lighten the skin. Get a whiter look. Women will put on an excessive amount of powder just to look more white. And unfortunately, the sort of being infected by the ailment, by including nationalism, is a disease that Muslims borrowed or transplanted from their colonizer. Racism and nationalism are two. Arnold Toynbee actually writes about this, a British historian, and he says the word that we colonizing Muslim lands, Britain controlling more Muslim countries than any caliphate in Islamic history ever controlled. He considers all of that something that Muslims can recover from. Right? He says, and if we infect Muslims with the twin diseases of racism and nationalism, in his opinion, they will never recover from that. And we must become honest about race. Yeah, Egyptian society has become, in my opinion, like a lot of other Muslim societies, deeply racist along colonial lines. The more Western looking you are, the more European looking you are. When I was growing up, bragging rights, where if you manage to, if you manage to end up with a woman who is blonde and blue-eyed, there are some Egyptians who are blonde and blue-eyed. That was like the highest dowry, the highest prestige. The parents talk to you, as if you're marrying the queen of the world. The darker skinned, the woman that you ended up with, the less prestige. And that's, we have to become honest about it, because you're not going to be able to challenge it unless we are first honest about it. And when I hear Egyptians, for instance, when they get angry and they'll call someone zingy, that's deeply offensive. And we must be honest in saying, do you realize that you have become racist? And that is, you cannot be a Muslim and be racist. It is fundamentally inconsistent. You cannot claim to be a follower of the Sunnah of the Prophet or follow in the path of the Prophet and to think lesser of a human being or to think differently of a human because they are darker skinned. It just, and that's, about liberation theology. I mean, look at what attracted people like Malcolm X to Islam. And the narrative that we don't talk a lot about, but the African American, the African Muslim movement in the United States, for them, embracing Islam was embracing a liberation theology against embedded racism. And that's something that we as Muslims should embrace and should realize that is the potential of our faith and the moral paradigm that God entrusted us with.
You've spoken so trenchantly about this pernicious internalization by Muslims of the very ideological apparatus that was constructed in order to colonize and oppress us. And yet now we take assimilation to its terms of being and of value as not only being, not as being a negative, but in fact, we see that as perversely the pathway to our liberation. And it seems one of the fundamental oppressive concepts that we have internalized is in the very way the idea of the human is understood. The Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter very persuasively and powerfully deconstructed how the idea of the human that was institutionalized and elevated through colonial modernity was really the human as the white Christian man in the American Constitution. We see it's also someone who owns property, in other words, the white Christian capitalistic man. And this figure of the human has been a vehicle for tremendous amounts of violence against not only dehumanized humans, but also the other than human world, the rest of the world that we derogate and denigrate as being non-human. Often when we talk about violence against non-human animals and non-human ecologies, people dismiss it as saying that we're prioritizing the well-being of non-humans when humans themselves are suffering so much oppression. And so humans are who we should really be caring about. And yet it seems as if the possibility of unlimited amounts of torture, death, violence inflicted against dehumanized humans has depended upon the acceptability, or us rendering acceptable the idea that you can inflict unlimited amounts of torture and death and violence on non-human animals, so that those who are reduced to the status of animal also become vulnerable to those forms of violence. Earlier in the discussion, you talked about how our abilities or our permission to make use of aspects of the natural world are really a trust that is conferred upon us and that we are obligated to respect, which I think is a profound shift away from concepts of human dominion that have, to use your terminology, infected so much of the way that we as Muslims think about our relationship with the non-human world. So can you talk a bit about how perhaps stripping away some of these ideas of dominion and human domination that have accreted onto our traditions, how instead, by stripping these away, we might think of a different way of what it means to be human in this world, drawing on our traditions?
Yeah, I mean, I really, again, you put it very eloquently, because it is really, I mean, this is a part of growing up. I mean, I really see it as a part of just growing up, understanding that whether we admit it to ourselves or not, but we have been infected by the way the human, as human, has been conceptualized, and very discreetly, and even in a discreet and an insular way, passed on to from the dominant cultures to the subservient cultures, and that is why just intuitively we react very differently when 40,000 people were killed because French intelligence worked with the Egyptian military, providing them with information that allowed the Egyptian military to exterminate 40,000 people, and no one cares. Now, and yet, but going, but you point to this a very important point. So it's not just the devaluing of, it's not just that we dehumanize the human, but part of the colonial paradigm was to colonize not just the people, but to colonize everything that was in the vicinity of the people. And so the attitude towards nature, the attitude towards animals, the attitude is that they can all be colonized. They can all be made to serve whatever the dominant special class deemed to be in its interest. And that class has no obligation to think about how much gold they are taking, what impact on the environment that has, how many rivers they are diverting, or whatever they did with the land was always deemed to be a natural right. And it's actually, I mean, it's only till very recently, the idea that you don't have a natural right to exploit things is a very modern, very recent pushback or counterposition to the dominant discourse in colonialism, which is basically, under the logic of some type of manifest destiny, it can exploit everything because, that class, for whatever reason, has an entitlement. Islam is, and I mean this in among the Abrahamic religions, it is only in the Islamic culture where there is such a heavy emphasis that you are going to be held to answer for every tree that you cut down, even a tree. If if you cannot justify the cutting down of the tree and pair the value systems that Sharia considers to be acceptable. So you can't say, well, it was just bothering me, because that's not a relevant Sharia category. It just being irritated by the sight of a tree. The Sharia itself defines what type of objectives would justify the cutting down a tree. Exterminating a single ant, even an ant, you are not to kill, not allowed to kill an ant without just cause. It's drilled within the Islamic norms that everything in existence belongs to God, and that it is God that made the decision who and what has a right to exist. So the dog, the cat, the insect, it is God made. There is an intentionality behind the existence of that thing. So God willed it. Now, are you sure you have just cause to justly exterminate what appears to be the will of God? So as several Muslim thinkers used to say, it is the will of God that, by the will of God, that a tree or a flower or an insect or an animal exists. So it is only the permission of God that would allow you to change the reality of that existence. And if you don't have that permission, and then you're in trouble. That meant, and even so, even in war, there are like extended discussions about, well, you know, at what point can you take measures, even in the war? You know, is it that, you know, just it protects the lives, because you know, at what point do you say, well, I have the harm that I can avoid by, let's say, destroying these trees, it rises to the level that then it becomes a just cause. And there are, you know, these debates, and there are some who have a very high demanding standard where it basically becomes only in very rare exceptions can you engage in the destruction of nature, and so on and so forth. But the point is the morally conscientious position that you are not free to just strip a land and develop a mall without fully thinking about not just how it affects other human beings, but how it affects all living beings, even ecologically. So you are not just free to say, well, you know, I want to take this land and deny animals the right to exist. Well, does it rise to the level of a just cause? This is why, because this is why the Islamic civilization was the first civilization to create charitable trusts to take care of animals and plants, and you know, so that's one thing. The other thing, do you know that there are a number of Muslim scholars, and all of them are medieval, who read the Quranic reference, وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, who your right hands possess. They said that this includes anything that is dependent on you, or that requires your protection to continue existing. And so when Allah would say you owe an obligation to orphans and refugees and the indigents and who your right hands possess, they said this includes all animals and all beings, because they are literally at your mercy. So your rights hands possessed, so they at your mercy. So you not only have an obligation not to harm, but you have an obligation to serve. In the same way, your obligation is not just not to harm an orphan, but actually to do good by an orphan. So all these medieval scholars said you actually have an affirmative obligation to, and they actually, if you notice that a plant is drying up and you can water this plant, you actually incur a sin by ignoring the dying plant. If you could do something about it to save it. Now, my point though, all of this discourse, I find it in the books of tradition and, narrative upon narrative upon narrative. Why is it not a part of a modern consciousness? Why aren't we taught? Why isn't it those who teach us Islam in our schools, why don't they teach us this material? I submit to you the reason is because we are a thoroughly colonized people. And because those who created the educational institutions in the Muslim world, in the shadow of colonialism, didn't think that these courses needed to be emphasized and ignored these discourses. And so they were left out of Muslim narrative. And the result is we are impoverished. Although our religion, and when you think about it, it's also intuitively obvious. Yeah, of course, if God willed that this flower exists, I can't just pluck the flower and exercise my will to negate God's will. If I do anything, I better have God's permission. Now, do I have God's permission? Can you imagine if we raised our children to have that type of attitude towards everything in existence and in nature? Do you really have God's permission to kill a dolphin, to kill a whale, to do this, to do that? It's a different moral paradigm, a different moral outlook.
You so rightly said that we are impoverished by the erasure of these traditions. And it seems that it's not simply the we as Muslims, but we as a global community that's facing climate and ecological catastrophe. I think as Muslims, we're so used to having to apologize for our traditions or to say that they can be assimilated into a liberal world order, rather than thinking about Islamic traditions in conversation with other colonized traditions, indigenous traditions, African traditions, as resources that are vital for advancing our conversations, not simply about justice, but about survivability in this world. And so when you talk about the extreme restrictions that were placed on environmental destruction in the Islamic legal traditions, it makes me think about how even now in international law, ecocide, mass environmental destruction, is not considered an independent crime. In fact, there's an ongoing campaign that's been happening for decades to have international law recognize environmental destruction as a crime. And even when it is recognized in the very narrow context of international humanitarian law, which is a perverse way of referring to the laws of war, we know that the restrictions on violence that are placed in the international laws of war of military necessity and proportionality often end up, as scholars like I.L. Weitzman have pointed out, these supposed restrictions often end up simply being licenses to commit violence, as long as it can be ostensibly justified as proportionate, which, in the US military has meant you can kill up to 25 civilians for every one military target without seeking permission. And so these become a license for violence rather than a restriction. And in this kind of context, it seems absolutely imperative that we recover other ways of thinking about violence, about thinking about our relationship with other humans and other than humans as well.
I think it's like you pointed out. It's not just the Islamic tradition, but what is mind-boggling is that all the indigenous traditions, all these traditions that go back centuries, it seems like human beings they all reach the same point of wisdom about the respect they owe nature, and that they must, that nature is a living thing, and that nature has rights, and that these rights are sacrosanct. Because and the thing that is consistent through one indigenous tradition after another is the reverence they have towards nature. It is the first systematic breach in terms of attitude towards nature is what became the white man's colonial project, which divorced religion, divorced most values, divorced most morality, divorced most systems of wisdom, divorced cumulative systems of knowledge, and basically resorted to this myth of individualism and a myth of utility as the central value. And as a result, it greatly impoverished all of us collectively. And as you know, and you know, one of the things in international, it's not just that, as the way stands things now, that ecological crimes are not crimes under international law. You know, you can't take someone to the International Criminal Court, although they might do something that causes the extermination of, you know, millions of people, like the rainforest and what people are doing with the rainforest. But you know, even attempts at creating some type of firm international legal obligation for traditional systems of knowledge and trying to protect traditional systems of knowledge from erosion and destruction has been largely unsuccessful. And in my opinion, it is constantly confronted, or it constantly runs into racist opposition. I mean, the race factor is undeniable. It is always this dominant racial paradigm that comes and says, we don't want these systems of knowledge. We don't want to concede rights to these systems of knowledge because we like the way everything is organized around market value and utility, and ultimately the value of the dollar. And we're heading collectively as human beings to a disaster. I mean, it only, you know, people like Trump can pretend all they want that the danger is not there, but it's undeniable. I mean, it's like, it's really sad. Even like, you know, my 16-year-old son, I was talking to him about his and his friends' attitude towards the future. And I was really dismayed by the level of despair they have about the future. I mean, he seriously was thinking like, well, is the world going to end during my lifetime or shortly after my lifetime? And most of his friends think the same way, that, well, you know, we're living in a dying world, and this world is, and that's so, that's really dangerous. And it's, you know, how can people continue ignoring it? I don't know.
Sadly, I think we're coming to the end of our time for this event, and so I'll put one final set of questions to you. We had a question from the audience about the paradox of using frameworks of whiteness to understand whiteness, and how instead of looking at race purely through the colonial race paradigm, why aren't we simultaneously using our traditional language and logic of oneness as a solution to race violence? I think we covered some of this in the earlier questions about Tawheed, but perhaps you might want to add some reflections onto that. And my final question to you is about how the fundamental Islamic ethic of humility might inform our approaches to social justice struggles right now, in a context within which we're constantly facing not only overwhelming amounts of state and capitalist violence, but also violence against truth, violence against reality, tremendous amounts of disinformation.
Right.
We are often put into a position of having to very strenuously assert the truth and reality of the situation. How do we combine that with an ethic of humility built on, as you have so beautifully written about in your books, the position of legal scholars and other Islamic scholars that ultimately Allahu Alam, Allah knows best, and all of our knowledge as humans is contingent, partial, and fragile.
Well, okay. Well, there's two parts that maybe, but they're connected as well. You know, we started out with a quote from Cornel West, right? Well, I remember, I don't remember what year, and I, you know, my memory is a bit old, but I remember Cornel West once was giving a lecture, and this woman, you know, basically said, "Oh, you know, Professor West, you're wonderful, you're brilliant, and so on and so forth." But you know, I just want to ask you: isn't it time that we just get over this race thing? You know, we keep talking about race, keep talking about race. So it seems like she didn't get anything. So, but I was struck by his response to her, and he said, he told her, "Madam, you know, when I look into myself, I find racism within myself. So I suspect that the same holds true for you." And that is so true, because when you stand as a Muslim in the full Tawheedi paradigm, truly before Allah, and your aspiration is, "Allah, help me avoid shirk, all forms of shirk." And I know as a human being, and the humility mandates that I'm very honest with myself. And I know that, no, there are many aspects of me that is shirky. I worry about my income. I worry about my livelihood. I worry about the power of this person. I worry about the power of that person. I worry about this issue. But I acknowledge them, not to beat myself, not to flagellate myself, but to challenge myself. Okay, work on improving. But that same transparency and self-accountability, I also identify the ways that I am racist. I must expose myself and hold myself accountable for these various ways, subtle and not so subtle, in which I find myself influenced by racism. And the vigilance in saying, "No, I will not accept that, and I cannot accept that." Humility doesn't mean that you accept what is wrong and say, "Well, I don't have the power to correct it because I'm not, I must be humble and I can't assert what's right." That's not humility. That's often just cowardliness that camouflages as humility. You do your due diligence to know what's right. You engage in self-scrutiny and you hold yourself accountable, but you assert the principles of righteousness that God has taught you unequivocally and powerfully and confidently. Where does humility lie? The humility lies in saying, "I myself fail these principles. I myself must continue to push myself to rise to the level of these principles. The humility lies in saying there is so much that I need to learn about how to fulfill these principles, and I must continue learning. But humility doesn't mean to betray the principles. So some people think that, oh, humility is that I never speak about justice. That's not humility. You're a coward, and you are weak. No, you proclaim, you demand justice, and at the same time say, I am not saying that I am a perfect fulfillment of the principles that I proclaim, but we should all collectively aspire for the same principles, because they come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't come from me. And that is the role of religion in the public sphere, is that, we can, if we get into, if we don't have in AA, they talk about higher power, right? If you don't have a higher power, you often don't know how ultimately to resolve the question of what is right and wrong. But your tawheed is what gives you the resolve to say, no, there is clear right and wrong. And one race that has dominated the world now for a number of centuries and continues to dominate the world and continues to shape the value system of the world is simply, by the Tawheedi measures, wrong. And that's, the reason I'm emphasizing this is that so many Muslims seem to think that to be a good Muslim, you can't talk about race. But how are you going to resist racism if you don't talk about it? To be a good Muslim, you must fight racism, and wake up and smell the roses, or whatever smell whatever it is. The mess. We have been living under the shadow of a deeply racist paradigm since the emergence of colonialism and to our date. You want to change this reality? First, acknowledge it, because without acknowledging it, we don't move to the step beyond, to the next step. And I don't know if Aziza, if you run into the same experience, but I encounter a lot of resistance from Muslims coming to terms with this reality. I don't know if it's part of being colonially brainwashed in believing that we've reached a post-racial world, or that the way to be a good Muslim is to not acknowledge the existence of racism and racial politics, which is, is just very odd and very incoherent in itself.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, I have encountered that too. And I think we often have a very superficial and stereotypical idea of what structures of injustice look like. And in fact, I think all complicated, complex, and durable structures of injustice have operated by, as you have said, co-opting some of the people who are in the groups that are oppressed by it into maintaining its structures of power by giving them crumbs in order to keep them tethered to its leash. And as Muslims, returning to where we started with the land acknowledgement, I think we have to think about, as Muslims living on colonized land, how we also attempt to achieve our own advancement on this land by participating in structures of anti-Indigenous settler colonization, of anti-Black suppression and subjugation and exploitation. Thank you so much, Sheikh Dr. Khaled Abou al-Fadl, for so powerfully and thoroughly excavating for us some of the tools that we might draw upon as Muslims to engage in this vital internal as well as external work in performing the very necessary labor of creating a world that is not only beautiful, but also livable for us and for future generations of humans and other than humans. Your work is an invaluable resource in this struggle and a beautiful resource in this struggle. And so thank you so much for all that you have done with us here today, all that you have done and all that you continue to do. Thank you also to Grace and everyone else at the Usuli Institute. Everyone who's watching, please also check out the Usuli Institute resources and check out their webpage and support them to continue this work of reformulating, of recovering Islam as a resource for our contemporary struggles for justice. Thank you also to Khadija and everyone at the Noor team for all your work, all your labor in making this conversation possible. And finally, thank you to everyone who has tuned in with us today, everyone who listened, contributed, brought your thoughts and opinions and questions to this conversation. We very much look forward to continuing these important conversations with this series on what Islam looks like in public and beyond. So thank you, everyone.
Aziza, thank you. And I just want to say it is always a pleasure engaging with the Noor Center and having a conversation with you, Aziza. It's refreshing to find that level of discourse with a Muslim venue. It's really nice. So thank you.
The pleasure and honor is all ours. Any insight that we have, much of it is from your work. So thank you so much, Professor, and we look forward to future conversations and being in thinking and struggle together, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.